Be seated, please.
Well, I'm so excited to be with you today. I was able to preach here 3 years ago, and I guess you all forgot, so thank you for inviting me back. It is good to see Braden again after he was at Harding not very many years ago. And I am Tony's older brother, so I do have stories. May not have time to tell those today, but if you need those sometime for a roast, just let me know, and I'll be happy to give you those. And then you may not have known this, and I didn't know until Tony told me. So Mike Powers and I go back to high school. We played baseball together. I have stories there too, but anyway, we won't do that since he just became a shepherd, but good to see you, Mike. If you have your Bibles, turn to Mark chapter 8. We'll be there in just a few minutes, and I'm going to do my best to stay here and not wander away from the mic. I want to start with a story that I saw not very long ago. If you have Disney Plus, it may still be up there, but it's a National Geographic, and it was about the bull moose in Alaska. And maybe you've seen this, or you could have read an article back in the 90s about the bull moose and what they've done. In this article, it talked a great deal about how that as we get into mating season in the fall, that the bull moose would fight against one another to see who would have the dominance, who would get to mate, who would be the strongest and kind of run the whole thing. And so the bull moose, as each male came together, they would clash horns and fight together. And the winner was by who had the strongest horns that they didn't break and who had the biggest weight. And so they competed in that way. It talked that the battle of the bull moose was not really won at the moment that it happened. That this struggle between the bull moose as they locked horns was actually won many months earlier in the spring and the summer, as if they'd eaten the right things and if they had not just had the right diet, but how everything went into their life. And so it even told the story and chronicled the idea that some of the moose had not eaten well, and so when it came time to clash, their horns would break, and they wouldn't be as strong. Or some of them hadn't had the right diet or the other things in their life, and so they didn't have the weight to be able to clash. And the reason I bring this story up, because I think it reminds me of the conflict that we're in right now, is that there's kind of this great battle going on, and we're fighting the pandemic in the midst of this COVID-19 stuff, that we realize that some of us weren't strong and ready for what's going on. And the reason is we hadn't nourished ourselves enough to be ready for the fight that we're in. Or if we're talking about racial tension, or if we're talking about the other things that are going on in our life. And right now there's a lot of people struggling with the idea of loneliness and depression and just all kinds of things because of the whole environment that we're in, even including politics. And so why I bring this story up before we get into our text is that if you haven't prepared for the spiritual battle in your life, then you're going to break a horn. You're not going to be the way that you need to be. And so if you're not doing well in this time, then I want to encourage you as we get into our text to get ready for next time, because Satan is limited in his power, but he constantly comes around. And are you going to be prepared for what's going on in the midst of your life? But it really brings me to a story about my brother-in-law, Mike. So my brother-in-law, Mike, when he was 10 years old, they had a big fundraiser for the scouts that he was in. And how this fundraiser worked, they lived about 20 or 30 minutes, not quite as far or farther than from here to Springfield, but they got donuts, and they would get the donuts from this donut company. They'd go to their small town like Republic and sell those in businesses or the pre-orders and homes and all that. And so they got together. His dad was in the front seat driving that, a station wagon. If you don't know what that is, kind of like a minivan, but much shorter and no seat belts and all that. But anyway, so they completely loaded the thing up. And my brother-in-law, Mike, was sitting in the very back. And so they got all these donuts, and so on this about 30-minute drive, he decides to eat one. Then he eats another one. By the time they get 30 minutes to where they're going, he's eaten a whole dozen, and he's green. And his dad opens up the back, and Mike just loses everything. He has never eaten a donut since, right? So donuts put on weight, but not enough to win a spiritual battle. And I think that's where we are when I get to our text, is some of us have eaten, but we haven't eaten correctly spiritually, and so we struggle with where we are in the midst of our world today. So turn to Mark chapter 8. Now, when we get to Mark chapter 8, there's a couple things we need to know is there's kind of two miracles, right? The first one we read a few minutes ago from Mark chapter 6, all four Gospels, we're kind of used to it. Maybe from a child, we heard the stories about, the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 small fish. And when they're done, they have 12 basketfuls, although probably smaller baskets, not the same. But there's some contrast to what's going on in the midst of the story. Here's what I want you to realize from the first miracle. The people have been following for one day. The people that Jesus has given the 5 loaves and 2 fish to are from that Galilean area, but they're all Jews in that area. This is mentioned in all 4 Gospels. There's 12 small basketfuls left up. It's 5 loaves and 2 fish from a little boy. And Jesus had asked the question is, will you take care of them and you feed them? When we get to Mark chapter 8, it's a little bit different. There are 4,000. I know sometimes people say, well, they got the facts confused. That's not what it is at all. It's completely different. And in this one, he's in a different place, and the people have been following for 3 days. They're extremely hungry. They're in the Decapolis area, so they're Gentiles. Completely different audience. This one's only mentioned in 2 Gospels. When they finish, there are 7 large basketfuls left, and there's 7 loaves and a few fish. Often we recite it as 3, but a few fish in this miracle. We're going to read from Mark chapter 8, the first few verses, and I want you to listen to the Word of God as we get into our text today. And I'm reading NIV today. During those days, another large crowd gathered, and since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him. And he said, I have compassion on these people. They have been with me for 3 days, and they have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll even collapse on the way because they've come such a long distance. His disciples answered, but where is there enough food in this remote place for anyone to get enough to eat? Well, how many loaves do you have? Jesus said. 7, they replied. He told them, have the crowd sit down on the ground. And when they'd taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and he gave it to the disciples. And he set before them the people, and so they did so. And then he had a few small fish as well, and he gave thanks for them. And also he told the disciples to distribute them. And the people ate until they were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 full basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present. And having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and then went to another region. And the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus, to test them. And they asked him for a sign from heaven, and he sighed deeply, and he said, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to them. Then he left, got back in the boat, and crossed to the other side. There are a couple things that I think this text tells us and reminds us. It may remind you a little bit of the Israelites when they had been traveling, right? And Moses, the people plead, and God provides manna, and they're taken care of. It may remind you a little bit of God's prophet, Elisha, when he's kind of out in the desert, and God makes sure that he gets enough to eat in the midst of that from 2 Kings chapter 4. It may remind you of the Good Shepherd from Psalms, or there might be other passages that reminds us. The idea is God wants to take care of his people, and he wants to meet our needs. But sometimes we've missed that. There's another thing I think we need to realize, is we often think, oh, the disciples, they're so dumb. How did they not know this? Well, Jesus completely showing a different point. Because in the 5,000, these were his people. And Jesus said, look, these are my people, I'm taking care of them. When we get to 4,000, Jesus is saying, oh, these are my people too. You need to care about them too. And I need to hear that today. Because it's easy for me to take care of my own, and it's harder to take care of other people. And Jesus is making the point is, yeah, it works for my people, but it works for all people because all lives matter. And you need to remember that all lives matter. But from to the text, there's a couple of things that I think that we need to bring up. Is that Jesus says, hey, what do you have? My boys like to travel with us, and so one of them's here today, but One time we were driving from Arkansas all the way to South Carolina, and I wanted to make sure they had the experience of going to the Varsity. And I don't know if you've eaten there. It's all fried food. It's right by Georgia Tech. But when you walk in, this tradition's leaving some. You walk in and they go, "What do you have? What do you have?" And that's how they ask what your order is. My boys now for 20 years have repeated that. Sometimes we walk into a restaurant, "What do you have? What do you have?" But Jesus asked this question, "What do you have?" What do you have? It's a simple question, right? But it's a question that hits me between the eyes because I struggle sometimes in focusing on what I have because I am more easily to focus on what I don't have than what I do. And God meets all my needs, but I focus on my wants rather than what I actually have. It's amazing because my wife has a whole closet full of nothing to wear. And my boys have a whole refrigerator full of nothing to eat. And I have a whole plethora of channels of nothing to watch, although that might be a different indicator. And so our struggle is, do you focus on what you have and letting God use it, or do you focus on what you don't have? And so Jesus says, what do you have? Now they should have remembered, right, before, right, we had a little boy's lunch, John tells us about, that Andrew found. So what do you have now? And they begin to mess up because they focused on what they don't. And by the way, their answer is just send them away. Just send them away. We can't do this. And Jesus says, oh, no. We need to meet the needs of the people. Yeah, you still got to focus on teaching, but are we willing to meet the needs of people and use what you had? It's amazing because the miracle happens in the hands of Jesus. And I think we struggle with the fact that we sometimes try to be manufacturers, and that's not what this text says. You are not called to be manufacturers. You are called to be distributors. And that's what we fail to see sometimes. Jesus says to the disciples, hey, don't try to manufacture bread. Don't try to manufacture the gospel. Don't try. Instead, would you take what I have and distribute? Or would you take what you have and distribute? The reason I chose this text, besides preaching a couple of weeks ago and changed it up a little, is because I think there's a Thanksgiving theme in the midst of this text. And are you thankful for what you have? Who owns it? And are you willing to share it with somebody else? Because people matter. It makes a difference. I am more willing to send people away than try to figure out a way to distribute. I'm more willing to focus on what I don't have rather than what I do have, and I'm more willing to be selfish rather than share with the things in the midst of my life. You see, the crowd was a problem to the people, but not to Jesus. The disciples wanted to send them away or said, there's no way we can raise money, and Jesus says, no, you need to meet the needs of the people that are here. So when it comes to problems, do you see what can't happen, or do you see what God can do and is willing to work through in the midst of your hands? Maybe you want to go and find a young boy and say, oh, here we go, let's see what we can do with this. Are you willing to say, what do I have in the midst of my world to make a difference? God doesn't call you to meet everybody's needs. He calls you to meet the needs of the people that stand in front of you. But we struggle with that. This year has been really different at the university campus. One college student, one young man, a freshman, said, my problem is I don't know what any girl looks like except for her eyes. It's made it really hard. But my favorite comment was from one young man, freshman, that said, man, it's a great time to be ugly. So, what do you have? What do you have? You see in this text, that's the question that we're asking. Do you have compassion that Jesus is in control of our life, or are you blind to what He can do? Do you believe that He can use what you have? Because I often forget and don't realize I have blind spots. And I often really don't get that I am limited and try to do things on my own. I have missed so many things in the midst of my life because I focused on what I don't have rather than what I do have. And I'm very unwilling to be grateful for what I have and only see the things that I don't have. And so part of your challenge today is to say, what do I have? What do I have? And am I willing to use it and share it with God? My mother-in-law, one of her famous authors was Irma Bonbeck. Now, I know this is older. Some of you may not understand. She was interviewed in Red Book in 1992, and I know that's older than all of you. But I think this story rings true. She says this: there's over an estimated 1.5 million people that at that time that were living with bouts of breast cancer. And I think my mother-in-law loved this because she dealt with breast cancer. She said, every time I forget to feel grateful, I find myself among them, and I hear the voice of an 8-year-old girl named Christina. She had cancer of the nervous system. She was asked what she wanted for Christmas. She thought long and hard about it, and finally she said, well, I don't know. I have 2 sticker books and a Cabbage Patch doll. I think I have everything. And I think she was right. What do you have? What do you have? And are you willing to share it with somebody else? See, I easily focus on what I don't have. I easily focus on God, do something, instead of can I do something. And it's easy for me to hold on to what I have instead of sharing it with others. So on Thursday, as you sit around your dinner table, whether it's large or small, whether you Zoom with family or FaceTime, or maybe it's just you, do you focus on what do I have? What do I have? And am I willing to share what I have with someone else? I think we can't see those things for a couple of reasons. John MacArthur wrote in one of his books, we don't see what other people's needs because of these 5 reasons. Because we're trying to please someone. So who are you trying to please? Because our own securities, we tend to pamper rather than deal with. Because of whom we're trying to compete, we can't see what we have. Because we were trying to reward ourselves instead of rewarding others. And because we cover the shame in the midst of our lives, we develop blind spots to what we can do in the midst of our lives. I think this text has a great deal to say to us today. And the question is what do you have? And what are you going to do with what you have? I'm going to end with this story, and maybe you've heard it. This is even older than the other one in 1992 because it started in 1985, which, boy, that seems like a really long time, right? But it still continues. In fact, there's a follow-up story done in 2014, and you can still search it today. There's a young man at the time. His name was Scott McCauley. He was 24 years old in 1985. His parents had just gone through a divorce, and he realized that he was not going to have a place to go for Thanksgiving because his parents were kind of using him as a pawn, and there was no place for him. And as he looked around, there was really no place for him to go, and he said, this should be a time of blessing, not a time of aloneness. And so he said, I'm going to do something different. In fact, he decided that on Thanksgiving, he was going to make something special happen. And so in 1985, he took out an ad in the paper, and I know some of you don't even know what a paper is, but he took out an ad, and he put in the ad, he said, if you are alone for Christmas, or if you're alone for Thanksgiving, come to my house. The table is always open. And he prepared a meal, not knowing who he'd get. He got a few phone calls. He said, it's really not about the fireworks or the hoopla. It's about being together and realize that we have blessings, and you can't have much fun by yourself. So Scott found out that in the invitation that first year, a few people showed up, and he said, this is great. Even if it's just a few, I can do more. And so he decided to hold a dinner every year. And in 1914, on the follow-up, 84 people showed up at his house, and he still continues to invite people. And one thing that he says is, there's always room at my table for you. Mark chapter 8, Jesus says, there's always room at my table for you. You see, you're valuable. And every person you come in contact with is valuable whether they believe the same way you do or not. And Jesus says, what do you have? What do you have? And are you willing to use it for him? And so as we end today, most of us in here are followers of Jesus. And our challenge is, are we willing to see what he's given us and use it for others. If you don't know Jesus, then you really don't understand what it's like to share and sit at a table and be valued. And you may want to study the Bible or come to know him, and we're willing to do that today. But I want to leave you with this. You are valuable. What do you have? And you're always welcome at his table. Let's stand while we sing.